Welcome to Wisdom Inspired, a podcast designed to help high achievers to eliminate burnout and overwhelm. Now let's prepare to open our hearts, our minds, and our notebooks to receive today's wisdom. 1 and 9 as a backdrop and a foundational scripture. And we see that Joshua has been given a huge undertaking to lead the children of Israel who had been wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years. So it is his job to take over where Moses left off. And so he had to claim the land from its inhabitants or its squatters, if you will, fight and lead the battles, provide spiritual leadership, and lead them, again, to the promised land. So with this overwhelming feeling from the weight of what's before him, the Lord offers words of encouragement. And he says, "Have I not commanded thee? Be strong, courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." And so now Joshua becomes the leader God has designed him to be. And so having said that, in my study, I believe that this chapter alone, just this first chapter of Joshua, there are some valuable leadership takeaways that we can apply to our lives as believers of Jesus Christ who are high-achieving preneurs. So let's get into 4 of these valuable leadership takeaways, okay? All right, so if you can write this down, or you may have to go back to the episode and write these down. But anyway, let's get into those 4 principles or those 4 takeaways, okay? Number 1, focus on the purpose of God. Focus on the purpose of God. God speaks. And in verse 2, God says, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel." And so Joshua had been the helper and the assistant of Moses, and now he has these new responsibilities. So he's leveling up. He has to level up, right? And so following the exodus from Egypt and the 40 years of wandering around in the wilderness, this newly formed nation is now poised to enter into the promised land, conquer the inhabitants, and occupy new territory. And so God makes it clear that this is his work. Just as he had used Moses, he now uses Joshua to lead them to the promised land. And those of you who are on the call today, you have clients. If you're a financial consultant, you have the responsibility of getting your clients to the financial promised land. If you're a business coach, you're responsible for getting your clients to maybe the clarity promised land or the mindset shifting promised land. But the whole point that I'm trying to make here is to stay focused on the purpose of this assignment that God has given you. So number 1, stay focused on the purpose. Number 2, stand on the promise of God. Stand on the promise of God. God always keeps his promises. And in verse 3 of that same chapter, he says, "Every place that the sole of your feet will tread on, let me say that again. Every place that the sole of your feet will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised Moses." And in verse 5, he says, "No man will be able to stand before you all the days of your life." And he promises, "Just as I was with Moses, so will I be with you. I will never leave or forsake you. And so God also gave Joshua a promise for each of the instructions that he gave him. He said, you, the Israelites, will go into the land that I intend to give you. That was in verse 2. He says, no one can stop you from taking this land as long as you live. That's what he promised. That's what God promised him. He says, you will win everywhere you go. That's in verse 7. And so God had been with Moses. Now God has promised Joshua that he would be with him also. Verse 6 says, before Joshua could lead his people, he too had to put his faith into action. He had to be strong and not afraid. And because of his promise, we are also assured of his presence, that we will win, right? And so he promises that no matter what, okay? Number 3, lead by the precepts of God. So number 2 was stand on the promise. Number 3 is lead by the precepts of God. So the definition of a precept is a guiding principle or rule that is used to control, influence, or regulate conduct. For example, a precept is a commandment found in the 10 Commandments, okay? It is a commandment or direction meant as a rule of action or conduct. Okay, you got that, right? Because we've gone over precepts. Coach Dorothy has given us quite the description of precepts in some of the previous episodes. So, but 2 different times God speaks the same words to Joshua. He says, be strong and courageous. And the root word for courage literally means to put your heart into it. When God sees our fears, he says, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, thou shalt not overwhelm you. Now that scripture is from Isaiah 43, 1 and 2. But the whole thing, the whole point I'm trying to make here is that you have his precepts. You have his guiding principles to abide yourself by, right? And so when you look at that, you have something to fall back on, in other words, right? You have his instructions. You have your orders from headquarters, okay? All right, so lead by precepts. I hope that made sense. Number 4, remain in the presence of God. Remain in the presence of God. Joshua needed some assurance that God was now going to be with him. So when we look at Joshua 1 and 5, it says, God says, just as I was with Moses, so will I be with you. I will never leave you, nor forsake you. And God says, my presence will go with you. Never will I leave you, nor forsake you. And even when we look at in the New Testament, Hebrews, that was Hebrews, I believe, Hebrews 13 and 5. But anyway, go and look at that because I believe that it will really help you to understand that God is always with you. He has made a promise that his presence will always be with you. And it is God's presence that gives you the power to do what he's called you to do. So have your business meeting with him. Invite him into your business. Consult with him and do what he says. Because he wants to be in the middle of your business. He wants to be in a priority position of your business. And so it is up to you to remain in the presence of God. When you have haters, focus on the purpose, stand on the promise, lead by the precepts, and remain in his presence. When it seems like no one is taking you up on your offers and proposals, focus on the purpose, stand on the promise, lead by the precepts, remain in the presence, in his presence. When it seems that there's a whole lot of chaos around you and you feel a little overwhelmed, focus on the purpose, stand on the promise, lead by his precepts, and remain in his presence. Well, I hope you've been encouraged today. I hope you've been encouraged to be bold, courageous, and fearless, knowing that God is with you at all times. Well, don't forget to go to wisdominspired.net to find the links to all the platforms. Listen to the previous episodes, subscribe, and leave us a review. And if you'd like to know more about our virtual co-working and collaborating community, send us an email to hello@aaccoworking.com. With that said, meet us back on the line next time, same place, same station, with more wisdom inspired. Have a wildly productive day. I hope you enjoyed the episode of Wisdom Inspired that was brought to you by the AAC Co-working Community, a virtual community designed to support female entrepreneurs, business owners, and freelance professionals. For more, go to wisdominspired.net.